and I'd like to welcome you all today to our fall tour, celebrating Lincoln Woods, our history of building community. And indeed, Lincoln Woods is a community very much worth celebrating. It was mixed income development created at a time in the 1970s when fair housing in this country was really just at its beginning point. It was a community that was forged by the hard work of the Lincoln Foundation, the Rural Land Foundation, town leadership, and people throughout the area, people who lived here, people who wanted to live here, who were really committed to having multifamily options in Lincoln. And Lincoln Woods continues to be an inspiration for our community to this day. And its lessons inform our current efforts to make multifamily housing easier to build in Lincoln as we consider rezoning areas around the train station to provide for more multifamily housing so that people who want to be in our town have more housing choices. You will see today, both through our lecture and our tour, what makes this a remarkable community. The people who live here, and also the architecture that frames nature and allows people both to have a sense of being at one with nature and also part of a very vibrant community, both the community here at Lincoln Woods and a short walk away to the shops, to the train stations, to our cultural institutions in town, to our school, all connected together in a very coherent and holistic manner. I hope some of you were able to join us at different forums through the summer and yesterday at the State of the Town meeting to talk about the town's discussion about rezoning around the station area. And I hope you'll stay engaged and add your voices to the conversation. It's a very important one for us to have as a community. Before we begin, I wanted to thank the Lincoln Woods community and the community builders for hosting us today, and Bob Dam is in the back, and so he's been very instrumental to helping us, as well as Joe Salvia. I wanted to thank Lincoln Woods residents Deb Howe and Ansha Dugavat, who is here, who have so generously opened their homes for us to take a tour of, which you'll see the second half of the event. And Ansha is going to perform for us. She's a very talented musician, and we're looking forward to her performance during our refreshment at the end of the tour this afternoon. And Deb, you'll hear her lecture about the landscape of Lincoln Woods after Woody and Gus' lecture. I'd like to thank our board members, Dan and Joe Robot, Matt Anderson Miller, Judith and Packy Lawler, Sebastian Barbell, Alex Bennick, and Mark Guttman, for all of their work in organizing today's event. And I'd like to thank and now introduce Woody Arthur and Gus Brown, who are going to provide their thoughts on the architectural and social history of Lincoln Woods. Woody is a FOMA board member, Lincoln resident, and a very talented architect. And Gus is a lifetime resident of Lincoln, former member of the board here at Lincoln Woods and on the board of the Lincoln Historical Society. And I think you'll really enjoy hearing their thoughts about what makes this such a special place. So thank you.
Thank you, Andrew. Appreciate it. Maybe somebody could hit the lights, because I've got some slides that are.
I think I'll sneak through.
Oh, well, I hope you can see this okay. We don't have blackout shades, but thank you and welcome. Thanks for taking part of your afternoon to take a look at this. Lincoln has for a long time revered the land. We love our landscapes here, and not just the open space such as Common Farm over here for materials you can see, but also the woods and other types of landscape characteristics that are characterize our town. I'd also like to say that one of the characteristics of modernism in Lincoln has always been a careful consideration of the design of buildings in terms of how they relate to the landscape, how they nestle into the land without dominating. I think Lincoln Woods is a really good example of that. You can see in this aerial view that a lot of attention was paid to taking the 125 units that make up this collective housing, and distributed in a way that respects and retains as much of the woods as possible. And it's a very different kind of presence. In fact, it's a very low presence as you move through town compared with the open spaces of Lake Common Farm. You know, as you come down Lincoln Road, it's a pretty discreet presence from the public side. The first structure you see over here is not really dissimilar in scale to the house next door, and as you move in, it feels a much smaller scale than what many people think of as a large, intensive housing complex. Even the main access path that comes from the parking along Lincoln Road is really through a swath cut through a mature wood, and it arrives, you know, just outside here where you signed up today at the covered course out front. And as Andrew mentioned, a lot of care was given to how this development was connecting to other features around us, including mall, health shops and restaurants, the supermarket, but also the train station, which is kind of integral to the plan here. And as we get into this, you'll see, and as you see from Deb, there's a lot of thought was given to how to be very respectful and to integrate the development with respect to a lot of the natural features that existed on the site, such as the stream that runs through back behind parts of the complex. So how did we get here? How did this design come to be? I think it's an interesting backstory. Houston Jackson was the architect, who was a longtime Lincoln resident and a member of the Rural Land Foundation, as well as the Lincoln the Housing Collaborative that began, the Lincoln Foundation. He was also a faculty member at Harvard's Architecture School, better known as the GSD. He was a colleague of Jose Luis Sert, who was a pretty well-known architect who joined up with Jackson and created a practice, a firm that was thriving for many years in Cambridge. Sert, who, this photograph on the right basically shows some of the leading lights of modernism in Barcelona in the early 30s. On the left is Sert. In the center here is Walter Gropius, who lived down the street. And this is Le Corbusier, who was kind of an icon of the modern movement. So it's quite interesting. He was in this milieu of people who, you know, in today's standards, these architects were like the Tom Brady and the Lionel Messi and Roger Federer of the architecture world. And so it's interesting that when Gropius decided to retire in the early 50s, he personally invited Sert to take over and run the school for another decade or 12 years. So they were very influential. I think maybe some of the most influential practitioners being able to teach through the GSD. They were probably as influential as any around the Western Hemisphere, I would say. So this group also was this group of architects was very interested in addressing the challenge of how do we create housing in collective environments? How do we deal with cost-effective and efficient housing, particularly in post-war environments? So these are some sketches from Corbusier's early studies. You know, and one of the key problems, challenges, is when you have, say, a collection of small apartments or medium or modest-sized apartments. How do you combine them and keep them very humane and pleasant and wonderful to live in? And one of the challenges, of course, is the geometry of stacking these together. Is you have long walls that are common between two apartments that we call party walls. You can't really put windows in. So it's quite a design challenge, really, that has been addressed in many different ways. Corbusier developed a very ingenious scheme here for a project that was built in Marseille back in 1952, and he came up with this ingenious overlapping cross section. So this is a section through. These are plans of a couple of apartment units. You can see they're long and thin, but they have balconies and full daylight on either end. And by configuring them so that each apartment had a full 1 story plus a half story below, they get daylight views and cross ventilation across the entire depth of the building. And then he was able to stack them by offsetting how those half sections work. You have a central access street between them that provided access to each of those offset apartments. And this was actually built after the war, and here's an example of what one of these apartments looks like. They're relatively modest, but they do have full daylight on both ends, so they're really quite appealing. And they were, I believe, developed as affordable housing, but they've become since evolved into being sort of mixed income housing. They're apparently very desirable to live in, I must say. Of course, when it went up, nobody had seen anything quite like this before, so it had mixed reviews, so to speak. Reminds me, I think Mark Twain said that Wagner's music is better than it sounds. I think very well, but it's better than it looks. But Gropius was at the opening. He said, any architect doesn't think this is beautiful, ought to lay down their pencil. Because the architects, of course, love it. It's interesting that Corbu called that the vertical garden city. There's a lot, we don't have time to get into all the backdrop of that, but that very idea seems to be very much alive and well in other parts of the world. These are some examples of some high-rise towers that are literally integrating gardens in upper level units. And I think that's Milan and Singapore. So it's really interesting what's going on. Back to Sir Jackson. In the early 60s, they were commissioned by Harvard to develop married student housing just at the edge of the campus along the Charles River. You're probably familiar with this complex. Being inspired by what Corbusier did, they came up with some very clever interwoven apartment units and then assembled them in these three towers that are disposed around a common lower level plinth that includes a lot of public spaces as well as there's retail originally and then a lot of gardens and open space and childcare and so on. The search spent a lot of energy and time coming up with a system to try to mitigate the kind of large scale concrete volumes and try to bring some human scale to that. So I developed this elaborate gridded system of brise-soleils, which are sunshades, as well as different kinds of openings, windows, and ventilators that is not really uniform. It actually has quite a bit of variation. There's a lot of different color variation going on. So he came at it from a painterly standpoint, trying to reduce the kind of monolithic scale with smaller scale elements. Sir Jackson was very busy with a lot of housing projects in the late 60s or 70s. So this is, 71 is right around, I believe, when design was starting for Lincoln Woods. And in their office were projects, for example, at Roosevelt Island in New York, where they did this rather large housing project. You can see here they've evolved into having projections, volumes that project to create shadow and light and to bring the scale down and try to create some kind of human scale given this rather large volume. And likewise, a development closer to home in Charlestown, something called Charles Newtown, that was taking a basic scheme where they took a kind of a linear spine that connects all these different structures and then articulates that with projected volumes off the sides. And then within that kind of courtyard, they had other buildings that are lower scale that were staggered as well. And I think the idea was to try to, again, take this massive volume and break it down to something that's more appealing. I'm not sure how successful that is, because it's rather, in a way, because it's so rigid geometrically, it's monotonous as well as being kind of not really human scale. So, contemporaneous with this, Houston Jackson is in the office and is developing early plans for Lincoln Woods here. And you can see this sketch from '91 on the left, when it says Lincoln Foundation Housing, carries some of those same ideas along, where there's basically an arrangement where there's a spine, single-loaded spine with little volumes punctuating that along the length to provide some rhythm. But in this case, at least it's not as rigidly geometric. You're starting to inflect it around the perimeter to give it a little bit more organic flow, to create interstitial spaces that are more appealing and break down the scale. The model is also pretty interesting in that you can see actually at the end here, if you just make it out, that the single-story spine that was connecting these two-story volumes really actually had a pitched roof here and little dormers that pick up top light. So this was perhaps his attempt to try to take these kind of modernist ideas and make them more appealing in a Lincoln context, which has got lots of traditional gable homes at a much smaller scale. They developed a number of different unit types. This is 3 of them that there's a single bedroom, 2-bedroom, and a 3-bedroom apartment. The 3-bedroom is 2 stories. There's many more than that here. This is just a representative sample. There's a lot of different types of apartment units here. And I think that translated into further development. This is 3 years later, in '74, when construction drawings were just being completed. I think construction started right around 74, 75, yes. And you can see the site plan has evolved some more. It's a little bit more broken down. That long linear spine is no longer continuous. It's been broken in a number of places. And the forms of the buildings have modified as well. There's different depths and widths to these, and there's different lengths that have different kind of configurations. And it seems that what he might be doing is embracing more of a campus approach to bring some quads or some common courtyard type spaces into the layout to provide smaller scale common community places that help bring some variety and differentiation within the overall complex. I know it's a little bit hard to read. I know outside there's a fully rendered plan here. I just took a corner and put some color on it just to illustrate that as well. So you can see how this is, there's a 5-bay, a 3, a 4-bay, different configuration. And so each of these little structures is slightly different, even though they have a similar language on the outside. There's a lot of variation going on actually in the configurations and the geometric disposition of the parts. And the way they've been situated, for example, this little cluster here is situated around a dell. It's a low kind of wooded dell that I would guess pre-existed, and they were being very sensitive to try to work with the natural characteristics of the site as much as they could as they integrated this new rather large complex. And you can see how the way they drew this, they kept a very tight line to existing woods. So they kept as much of the woods as possible, including existing trees that are dotted around the site. But they didn't push back and make them an open space behind. It really allowed this to feel like it's sitting in the woods. This is a little walk around. People probably tour, or will be touring later. But if the net result of a lot of those moves is that it feels a little bit more broken down. It's very different from the previous housing projects we were looking at. It feels much more kind of a residential scale and much more in keeping with the scale of the residential developments in Lincoln. And for example, here the way you approach, this is a bar of about 5 units here, but the way the approach walk works with the vegetation, the view is disclosed as you move through. When you first come up the path, it's like a single entrance, and then it becomes more collective as you move through it. And here, the buildings, the bar buildings have been reflected along the site, so it breaks it up. It's much less rigid geometrically, so it feels much more inviting, much more of a human scale. And here's interesting, says, you can't probably read it, but it says Joe's Garden. I don't know Joe. Joe. But,
Past resident, he was a past resident who passed away.
Right.
So you get a tribute to him because he was here for a very long time.
right. It's kind of interesting because it's like a pocket park. Right? It's part of it's really kind of lovely. It's like a little community space for share. People get together and have a cup of coffee together, and right there in the middle of the community. So again, back to the aerial view, you can see this is all the variety of different building types. These in the center where we are now, there's 2 wings on either side of the community space here. These are probably the densest and most efficient layouts. These are double-loaded corridor buildings, so they're wider than the others. And this is the central corridor that runs down each of those buildings, and they're 2 stories. And on the ground floor is basically a series of pretty similar 1-bedroom apartments. And you can see each one You come in, there's a kitchen that opens up to a dining area and living area, and then on the other side is a bath and bedroom. And the only windows are on the exterior perimeter. There's no windows on the three sides. So, yeah, so what I think what they were thinking at the time was, let's extend that space from the apartment, the private space, out into the landscape a little bit. So they included these fences that run out in line with the party walls. And there's little patios and little planting areas that happen outside of each of those apartments. And you'll see that there's some that are a little bit more private and a little bit more public, but then they all kind of open up onto the woods. So if you're deep, if you say you're at the dining room table, your sight lines are kind of defined by the width of the windows there, looking out over your private patio into the garden and woods beyond. As you move out into the more public space, of course, it opens wide up. You get to share with all on the beautiful woods that surround the entire project. Here's a picture of that. I think this, to me, kind of sums up how well this works, because it's really this really simple, but I think kind of actually pretty graceful geometric composition of the single volumes that project out above the single-story roof line create a lot of light and shadow and variation during the day as the sun moves through. But they give a unification to the whole. It feels like one cohesive place, and allows for a lot of individuality down below at the garden level for people to kind of develop those or work with those, live with those as they want. Then there's, of course, the shared gardens and the woods beyond. So I think in the end, I think it's a great example of how Houston Jackson took a lot of these modernist principles that were fomented and being promoted by the leading people in the field during the era, and adapted them in a really effective way to both the unique characteristics of Lincoln. I hope you enjoy your tour. Thank you. Let's sort of tell us about the real story.
Gus has no slides. Gus has a couple of amusing anecdotes.
I will introduce Gus. Gus is a lifelong resident of Lincoln. He's been here for longer than he admits, and he's going to give you a bit of a history. Some of it is first-person history. Second, and then he lived through the era and has lots of stories packed away. But Gus will probably have 10 minutes or so. And then at the end, let's make sure we have to be, we have to leave here by 4. It's 3:40, so you have about 10 minutes, but it'd be great to have a few minutes of questions as well. Thanks, Gus.
All right, thank you, Chuck. Can we turn the lights on, because I don't have any slides and pictures on. That would be great. That's great. The thing about growing up in Lincoln is the number of people who do the same boomerang thing that you did. They go out for a while and they come back. I haven't seen the two Anderson sisters in the same place at the same time since St. Joseph's Church when we were kids. But it's nice. Karen, good to have you back, at least if for temporarily. Okay, as Andrew said, I am Gus Brown. My credentials for standing up here and talking are that I was on the board of Lincoln Woods for 15 years, and one of the reasons for that is I lived in Lincoln Woods for 5 years, because one of the things that Lincoln Woods was designed to do was to provide a landing strip for Lincoln young people who needed a way to get back into the community to start. So that's sort of why I know enough to be corrected by other people in the room. So I have 3 major questions which I'm going to talk about. First is, what is Lincoln Woods? Second is, why is Lincoln Woods? And the third one is, how did it all happen? And I've got 8 minutes now, so I'm going to do turbo talk. As Woody mentioned, there are 40 one-bedroom units. There are 13 3-bedroom units. There are 72 2-bedroom units in various shapes. And it was set up to basically provide housing for people who could no longer afford to be in their homes, widows. For those of you who remember Josie Govicandi and Mrs. Mills, whose farm is now Oriole Landing, Josie lived in the next building over, and Mrs. Mills was my downstairs neighbor, and both of them had been babysitters for me when I was very small. So that was the what. The most important thing is the why. And in 1969, Beacon Hill, in its infinite wisdom, created what's called Chapter 40B of the Massachusetts General Laws. And what that says, basically, is that any community that has less than 10% of its housing units affordable by state guidelines, low income, moderate income, any town with less than 10% can have a developer come in and build whatever the heck they want to build, as long as 20% of it is affordable housing. Goodbye zoning bylaws, it doesn't count. So some of the wiser people in town said, okay, how can we pre-op this? How can we get ahead of this? And people like Ken Bergen, lawyer, Tom Leggett, commercial developer, Willie Russell, senior executive at State Street Bank, Warren Flint, senior town patriarch, Mitzi Adams, architect. These people basically all got together and, working with the town, figured out a way to actually make it work. The first thing they did is they did what smart people do, is they went with the town government and said, we need to change the zoning down here, because if we're having 125 households moving into a neighborhood, Joe Hurd's community store, which was across the road where the Cambridge Trust used to be, was very small and couldn't really handle things, so they needed really a grocery store. They needed there's a drugstore here already, but they needed a post office, they needed shops, there was a hardware store over here. For those of us at a certain age, they actually had a store that you could rent VHS tapes. Your kids will need you to explain what a VHS tape is. So the town agreed to change the zoning. Then it had to be paid for. So what the Rural Land Foundation did is they went to the Codman Foundation, the Codman family, and said, you have given us, bless your hearts, 20 acres out back across that bridge. We'd like to buy 70 acres here from the Codman property. And so they did, and they immediately went to the Lincoln Foundation and said, we're going to let you buy this land for $1, which was creative. And people on the Lincoln Foundation, one of whom was Houston Jackson, said, okay, we can manage this. So what happened was the mall was built with some of the money that was paid by the developer to develop the mall, and Lincoln Woods was built with a loan from a mortgage from Mass Housing Finance Agency, MHFA. So these people really did a lot of financial and architectural magic just to make this place possible. And in the end, all Lincoln Woods has 20 acres. The rest of it is either the mall or it's the open lands out back going up to the trail that runs along the Lincoln Woods waste treatment plant. So that's the why, is to get ahead of somebody coming in and building whatever the heck they thought they wanted to build. This one would be designed by fantastic architects, it would be well financed, and it would provide a home. First dibs in 1976 were to Lincoln residents, and they had a drawing, and then it was other people beyond that. Mrs. Mills and Joseph Govicani were in that first drawing. But it is interesting that of the original occupants in 1976, 3 of them still live here. When you go shopping at Donlan, Shelley Smith, who will take your money, Shelley moved here in 1976 at the age of 7. And she's been here ever since. And that's exactly what the people who designed this and put it together wanted to have it happen. They wanted it to be a neighborhood. They wanted it to be a home that people would stay in forever. So that's kind of, let's see, I got through the what, I got through the why. And the how is a lot of Lincoln boards, a lot of Lincoln people working together and asking the question, how can we make this work? Those of us who remember Dave Donaldson, was the senior tax attorney at Ropes and Gray, and he was in charge of the joining of Mass General and the Brigham. And it took 4 years, and I said, he was the one who made it work. I said, Dave, how did you do that? And he said, it's easy. I would begin every meeting by saying, this is what we're going to talk about today. How can we make it work? And he said, we would just sort of eat the elephant one bite at a time. And Lincoln Woods exists here after almost 60 years because a bunch of people in Lincoln, a bunch of committed people in Lincoln kept asking, how can we make this work? And work it has, and work like it will be. Okay, at that point, I have told you all that I know, more than I understand. So, back, Andrew, for questions.
Thank
to
you. Thank you, Gus.
But I do it under 10 minutes. That's the
We
important part.
have plenty of time for questions, so please ask Woody, Gus, any of the FOMA folks too.
My understanding is that this was a co-op.
It
at
was.
one time. Was that the original?
Yes,
Okay.
yes, it was. Do you want me to take 2 minutes and explain why it changed?
Yes.
Okay, all right. People moving in here, especially low-income folks, had trouble getting the money together to buy the shares because with a co-op, as opposed to a condo across the street at Ryan Estate, of which I'm now on the board of, you know, in a condo, you own the condo, but you don't own the common spaces. If it's a cooperative, you have shares. You don't own your unit, period, zero, but you have shares. So one of the things that the Lincoln Foundation did was they helped put together the money for the Lincoln Woods Charitable Trust, which would actually buy shares for people moving in, because it was 1/3 low income, 1/3 moderate income, and 1/3 market income in those days. And when the people who borrowed $1,000 from the Lincoln Woods Charitable Trust moved out after 5 years, they would find the value of their shares had increased to $1,400. They would pay the $1,000 back, and they would keep some appreciation. So that was really cool. This was all one big room. Having been on the board, there was a long table up at that end of the room, and anybody who wanted to come to a board meeting could come to a board meeting and participate, and it was really, really cool, even in tough times. Over time, the price of the shares became really high. It just kept going up and up and up. And even market income people were having to stretch to buy the shares to get in. And at that point, a decision was made. The community builders had been part of the planning in the early 1970s. It gave a lot of help to the people who were designing this. They came in and worked with town boards and people like the RLF and said, okay, we will take over this property, we will buy it, and we'll assume the mortgage with MHFA, but we need to do it on a rental basis. So that was probably 20 years ago, just about, give or take.
Yeah, around 2009.
Yeah, okay, all right, that's 15 years ago.
Yeah.
All right, so that's how it changed from being cooperative with shares to being a rental. I think the distribution of income categories has remained about the same.
It's about the same.
About the same. And just one fantastic thing, this is a longer answer than you ever wanted, but the important thing is that none of the units has a tag on it that says this is for low income people, this is for moderate income people, this is for market. Every single one, you don't know who in what unit is in what income category, although Roger Burton's BMW being parked outside his unit made you think that it probably wasn't low income. So that was just really nice. Okay.
So it is now rental house?
It is now rentals, yeah. It's still with the income distribution.
One point I wanted to add that I think would be helpful in the context of thinking about rezoning more areas around the station for multifamily housing is the footprint that the Lincoln Woods stands on is almost 18 units per acre. So it's actually very dense housing. But when you're here, I hope everyone appreciates when you're able to walk around. You don't feel that it's dense housing. You feel that you're out in nature. From what Woody was saying and Gus is saying, you really have a sense of how design, architectural design, landscape design, town planning design help with improving our outlook on life and our ability to live well. And this is a really, I think, a super example of how design can influence and improve how people live their lives. And I hope that when we think about other projects that may be built in the future, we think of this as a model, and we really come back to the work that a lot of people did over time to make this such a successful design project, and to see how it really encourages a vibrant community of people who live here and really enjoy being part of the community in Lincoln Woods and being part of the community of the town and the surrounding area. So it's a very interesting thing to keep in mind.
Along those lines, Andrew, I was curious and fascinated to learn that the housing units were open first to Lincoln residents. I didn't know that before today. What would have to happen to make a future development have that requirement?
So I think that's really something as a town we can advocate for. I think any development that comes, we should be engaged. That's my personal opinion, and be really part of the process. And Lincoln has a wonderful tradition of listening, of incorporating ideas, of reaching a consensus that makes projects work for the special place that Lincoln is. So it's a very good question, John.
I just wondered how much of a community has evolved here. Are there community activities like block parties or,
I could pass that to the back of the room.
So we have a service coordinator here who helps out our residents, and she also does events. So there's events throughout the year. It's all different kind of events. Back in July, we did a barbecue for the residents. We cooked hamburgers, hot dogs, there was salads, desserts. She also does, we have a nurse that comes here a couple times a month as well, and anybody can come down and see her for any kind of problem. So there's events going on throughout the year. They're all different kind of events.
A lot has depended upon the residents here. Joey was mentioned, he was very instrumental with Ray in forming a Halloween committee, and we had parades, we had kids from all over town. They decorated the woods and they marched all over, and there was music, and we've also had in the past the dog parade. And I have lots of photographs, especially of my garden, because I was here for almost 10 years, and I'm an avid gardener, so if anyone wants to see my garden photos, I'm happy to show you.
You said something that I very much
I don't
wanted to
know if
mention.
you
I'm going to
know.
borrow 90 seconds of
I
this.
live in a real land.
Miss, when you mentioned children, one of the concerns was this was built for families, not so much the one-bedroom units, but the 2 and the 3-bedroom units were for families, and there was all kinds of pressure going up about what would that do with the school. And Bob Lemire, who was a genius for conservation, economics, and social good, said, here's what we propose, is over by Farrer Pond, some of the old Winchell land over there, and the Farrer land, why don't we have someone build condos for empty nesters? Condos for people whose house is too big, people who just want to live in a condo. He said those will be mostly older folks. They will have no kids. There will be no draw on the school system from them, and their tax money can be used to counterbalance the kids who would come to Lincoln Woods. And among the kids who came here, I don't know if you remember the Chow family. They were a Chinese family. They were from the killing fields of Cambodia. They got out. They were adopted by St. Anne's Church. family moved down over there. He was a mechanic, she did sewing and things like that. Their son Vaughn got a free ride at Colby College. When he graduated from Colby with a BS in chemistry, went to med school. So when you think about, you know, what this Lincoln Woods provide for people who might not have a good time providing it for themselves, it's a springboard kind of place. So, thank you.
Other questions for the group?
Given that the place is so beautiful, I can imagine there would be a lot of demand for low, middle, and open income units to rent. So is there a wait list, or what's the turnover?
The fast answer is yes, and I'm gonna let you go manage.
So we do have a waiting list. It's very long. We have a really big, for one bedroom apartments, it's very long. For 2 bedrooms, it's a little bit less. And then for 3 bedrooms, it's also very long because we only have 12 3-bedroom apartments, so the waiting list gets a little bit longer because people stay here longer in the 3 bedrooms as well. The turnover, it depends. It's kind of hard to predict. Last year we had, I think, maybe 5. This year we've had about 12. So it just kind of depends. But we always tell people, you know, could be a while, could be less. And then we contact them when they come up to the top of the list.
Thank you, Bob. Sure. All right. Well, thank you, Woody, Gus, and Bob, our resident expert, for your remarks. We will have you step outside and assemble on the stairs right outside, and Deb Howe will present her remarks about the landscape of Lincoln Woods. So, and then after Deb and touring the 2 homes, you'll come back here for refreshments.